So we're going to move on to another potter. He's the last one we'll look at. His name is Euthamides. And this is called the Three Revelers, which is an Athenian red figure amphora from Volsi, Italy. It's 510 BCE. It's about 2 feet high. So around this time, there's another artist, and he's experimenting with the human figure as well, using the new red figure technique. And his name is Euthamides, and this was painted by him in 510 BCE. And this amphora depicts 3 tipsy men, which is kind of an appropriate subject for an amphora, since it is a wine storage vessel. I think I'm looking at the wrong one here. Sorry. And as you can see, the artist is experimenting with the human form. So that conventional pose that we've seen with the profile head and the frontal eye has really been rejected. And the torsos here are shown, they're foreshortened. That is drawn in a more of a 3/4 view. So you can see his is kind of twisted a bit, and you can see there's some foreshortening going on, which creates depth. And the central figure is of particular interest because he is shown with a twisting spine, and then kind of his buttocks is shown in kind of a 3/4 view. So this is a really unique study of the human body and how it works. So it's really apparent that the artist is interested in showing the human form in varied positions. You can see there's a figure here. He's got one of his feet up, another one here. So it's also inscribed with a note. The space it's called Euthamides painted this as never Euphronios could do. So it's apparent there's a bit of a rivalry present between the two artists, who are both apparently interested in the human form as well. So there's a couple of other pieces done in red figure that show an interest in more naturalistic human poses. But we're going to move on to kind of the transition into the classical period from the Archaic period. So the years after and before the 500 BCE mark, the period of transition in architecture and architectural sculpture into the transition from the Archaic into the classical period, which is the next period, or early classical, I guess I should say. So the next temple we'll be looking at shows some of the changes that are going to be taking place that will be kind of the transition from the Archaic into the early classical. So the Temple of Atheia, looking southwest, this is in Aegina, Greece, 500 to 490 BCE. So right around that time when things are starting to change, starting to morph into more the early classical period. So this temple consists of 6 Doric columns on the short ends and then 12 columns on the sides. So it has more of a compact look to it. It's a later Doric temple, so the proportion is more 1:2 instead of 1:3 like the earlier ones that we looked at were. This one's more of a 1:2 ratio of the width of the sides to the ends of the temple. So it's more compact, and the columns begin thinning out, so they're a little thinner, and even the spaces between the columns is increasing. And the columns kind of transition rather smoothly into the architrave above. And in the interior, the architects replaced the single row of columns down the center with a double colonnade, and each row had 2 stories. So you can see this might be on the 2nd story because it's so high up. And this allowed for space for the statue at the center of the cella, and it also allowed worshippers to have a clear view of the statue from the altar due to a lack of obstruction. So that was nice. So here's the restored view of the Temple of Atheia. You can see the double stacked columns here, and this is the cella where the cult statue would be. And so painted life-size statuary decorated the pediments instead of the high reliefs. So they actually had life-size statuary instead of high reliefs on the pediments of this particular temple, which is a little different because the Archaic period temples typically had high reliefs in the pediments. And the theme of both pediments was the battle of the Greeks and the Trojans, but this sculptor kind of depicted different episodes of the battle, and Athena is pictured at the center of the combat in both pedimental scenes of this particular temple, and she's larger than the other figures because of her status as a goddess, and that hierarchy of scale is one way of showing her importance as a goddess. But the mortals are all the same size, which is unlike the pediment figures that we looked at from that early temple, Corfu, early archaic temple at Corfu, where every figure was a different size. So with this temple, they're starting to make every figure the same size, except for maybe the gods or goddesses. And there's a unified theme and consistent scale present in the pediment design of this particular temple. And so a unified narrative, basically, instead of just different narratives going on like the Corfu example had. So to keep the figures the same scale, the sculpture used a combination of standing, kneeling, sitting, and laying down figures. So we can take a look at what I'm talking about here. So this is a restored view of the facade of the Temple of Atheia. So that's one of them. So let's take a look at the dying warrior from the west pediment of the Temple of Atheia from Aegina, Greece, marble. It's almost life-size, 5 feet 2.5 inches long. If we compare the Eastern and Western figures, we can see a lot of stylistic differences. So the Western pediment features this very typical archaic figure of a dying warrior. He's really rigidly frontal. He looks directly at you, and his face features that archaic smile. So he's smiling even though he has an arrow in his chest. So he's not really showing any emotion, but he kind of looks like a mannequin, and he really doesn't represent that living being. He's very stiff and emotionless, and his hair has that repetitive pattern in it, not very naturalistic looking hair. But we'll take a look at the dying warrior from the east pediment of the same temple, and you can see that he's 6 feet 1 inch long, and we look at this picture of this dying warrior, and this figure is much more natural and complex. The torso is kind of at an angle to us. He's reacting to his wound. His face and his clenched fists kind of show that he's in pain. He's got his weight on his, trying to maybe get up with the weight on his shield. And he's not looking at us, and he's certainly not smiling. And it's thought that these sculptures on the eastern pediment were damaged, and they were roughly replaced about a century later. And so they're a little bit newer than the other Western pediment sculptures. And the Eastern warrior is no longer in the Archaic period. He kind of belongs more to the early Classical period. And these statues move more as humans would move, and they possess the self-awareness of real people. And this kind of marks the end of the Archaic age and the beginning of the early Classical age. And I'm going to stop the video here just to kind of so that we can begin the next video in the kind of more early and high Classical period.